From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I'm Julia Carr-Katzel. It's Thursday, July 6. In November 2020, a damning report about Australia's Defence Force was published. Known as the Brereton Report, it found credible evidence that our Defence Force had committed war crimes. This investigation shocked the nation and led to a reckoning within our Defence Force and the public's perception of it. And there was one woman, Samantha Crompvoets, whose research kicked off the whole thing. But in doing so, she has had to pay a hefty price. Today, Samantha tells us about that story and why telling the truth came at such a cost. And just a warning, this episode contains mentions of suicide. So Sam, if you could just start by introducing yourself.
My name is Dr. Samantha Crompvoets. I'm a sociologist and I've been working in and around government for the last 15 years.
Okay, so Samantha, I want to understand how an academic and sociologist became the person who triggered the Brereton Report, the biggest inquiry into war crimes in Australia's history. So where does this story start for you?
It starts when I suppose I left academia, left ANU and started my own research consulting business that was really looking at a whole range of policy challenges in different federal agencies and other private organisations, and I'd started to do a lot of work on veterans' health and wellbeing, and that had led me to building some relationships with people like Angus Campbell. He was the Chief of Army and now he's the Chief of the Defence Force. And General Jeff Sengelman, who was the Special Operations Commander. And I had started to do a lot of contract research for them. So I was doing this work, and in 2014, the Lindt cafe siege happened.
The Lindt Cafe siege was the day terror struck the heart of Sydney.
Man Monis, armed with a shotgun and what appeared to be a backpack bomb, walked into the Lindt Cafe and took 18 hostages.
We can see some heavily armed policemen and flashes of gunfire. It does appear...
The execution of cafe manager Tory Johnson forced their hand.
Yeah, we locked eyes and I engaged and shot the terrorists. There's a lot that occurred.
So the commentary after the Lindt Cafe siege was centred around whether or not it should have been the police force who went in and dealt with the situation, or whether or not they should have called in special forces who have a different approach to dealing with hostage situations and potential terrorists.
Police snipers had their guns trained on Man Monis.
He's got a woman with her hands up, kneeling down in front of him.
But why didn't he take the shot? The sniper in charge, Sierra 3-1, argues he should have and is suing the police force for not being allowed to do his job.
So there was a lot of commentary around should the special forces be used for domestic counter-terrorism? Really, what was their capability? Who was responsible for what? And I was invited to do some research for General Sengelman at the time to understand people's perceptions of what the special forces was really, and not just anyone's perspectives. This was the perspective of other agencies like ASIO, AFP, to really find out what they thought Special Forces' job should be.
Okay, and so how did you go about that research, and what was your understanding at that point of what Special Forces actually is?
So I knew Special Operations to be a number of different units, the commandos, the Special Air Services Regiment. There's about 7 different units that sit under Special Operations, and I knew that historically it had been very secretive and classified in terms of what they actually did. And my task was to really go and understand what was that perspective from government ministers, from the heads of different federal agencies, from people in the AFP who had been involved in the Lindt Cafe siege, also with experts in domestic counter-terrorism in Australia. So there was a range of people I was interviewing, as well as all of the defence senior leadership. And what I gathered from them was a whole range of views. But what was very common was this sense that special forces were regarded highly in terms of what they could do. But the comments that followed were things like, it's good to keep them on a short leash, got to keep a close eye on them. There was this sort of rogue element that was referenced. And so from that point, I wanted to talk to people, the soldiers and officers in Special Forces, really to understand the context with which these references were being made. And it was at that point that the study changed quite dramatically.
Okay, and so why is that? What did you discover?
At first, it was stories about general bad behaviour, about use of drugs, about prostitution. There had been rumours and accounts in the media about what had been happening at the barracks in Perth in terms of weapons going missing, ammunition being sold to bikie gangs. There was this general environment of misconduct that was acceptable. So initially I started hearing more stories in line with that. I'd heard stories about the collection of trophies, like the prosthetic leg, that were being glorified and put up in the place where they drank on operations. And then I heard stories of unlawful killing, so of murder. There was one interview I did in a library cafe where we sat talking, and it was that interview that was probably a real turning point for me. And the person I was speaking to just was so, I guess, morally damaged by what he had witnessed. And the way he told me these stories, these absolutely horrific stories, in a very desensitised, disconnected way, that I found really shocking. And also him just saying to me these things happened all the time. So it was the way he described the normality and repetition of some of these actions. That's when I knew there was something really, really wrong. It wasn't just a few stories. It was a pattern of behaviour.
That must have been incredibly shocking to hear. So what did you do after that? What did you do with that information?
Well, I went and I spoke to Sengelman and to Angus Campbell and just kind of said, what do you want me to do with this information? Like, I'm hearing these stories, and they both just said, write it all down. Like, write it all down. And then I put it in 2 reports. So I have the main report, which answered that initial research question around the capability and perspectives. And then I had this, what was referred to as the annex, that became the much more graphic description of stories and misconduct that I had been told.
Good morning, everyone. Today, the Australian Defence Force is rightly held to account for allegations of grave...
So the 2 reports became the trigger for the Brereton inquiry.
Justice Brereton considered in detail 57 allegations of incidents and issues.
And what Brereton's task was to, I suppose, test what I had written in the report and see if there was evidence that he could find to back that up.
These findings allege the most serious breaches of military conduct and professional values, the unlawful killing of civilians and prisoners is never acceptable. It's my duty and that of my fellow chiefs to set things right.
So that became the biggest inquiry into war crimes in Australia's history, and you became known as an author for those prior 2 reports. So what happened once your face was splashed over newspapers and your name became to be known?
I suppose I became a really easy target, and I realised that when I read the Brereton report for the first time, I was completely overwhelmed, actually. I think because so much of it had been redacted, except for my name, and that exposed me, I guess, and made me a bit vulnerable because I was just this easy target, this civilian who'd never been to war, and that I could have no understanding or idea of what it's like to be in war. And of course, I don't have any idea. But as we know, and as has been cited many times from the Brereton inquiry, none of these events or atrocities occurred in the heat of battle. So there's no real justification for it. But that point is largely ignored by the people in support of, say, Ben Roberts-Smith. So there was Brendan Nelson, who was the head of the War Memorial at the time, who was quite outspoken in saying, who is this feminist civilian sociologist, and what does she know? So there was just there were those attacks on my credibility, but that I couldn't possibly understand, the context in which these hard decisions have to happen in war. I think there was a general tolerance for the fact that I had written that report, but that I wanted to keep talking about it and have a national conversation around what it meant and why it happened. There was zero tolerance for that. So it was very clear I had to shut up.
So you received a lot of pushback and criticism, people trying to silence you, and I understand that some of that criticism also came from senior politicians. Tell me about that and how that impacted you, not just professionally, but also personally.
Thursday, I speak with the Minister for Defence and member Dixon, Peter Dutton. He's online this time from Canberra.
Yeah, so Peter Dutton spoke to Ray Hadley on 2GB and he was asked directly about my work and my contracts.
It's a woman named Samantha Crompvoets, and the story goes that she's findings of illegal violence helped spark the Brereton inquiry into the alleged misconduct of Australian Special Forces in Afghanistan.
Dutton's response was, well, I don't think we'll see work like that, being contracted again.
I've made my view very clear to Defence, and I don't think you'll see any more contracts awarded in this regard.
Okay, what that meant was a message to all of Defence, like that I was this liability and a risk. The same thing in Senate estimates. Jackie Lambie, just ranted for about half an hour about who was I.
Why did you hire her in the first place? Was her expertise in military sociology of the ADF back in 2012? And did she have a back book of peer-reviewed research in military sociology to support her?
It was all about risk and about my credibility. The end result was, my contracts were cancelled. So I was really being used. This was about veterans. It was for Dutton and Lambie, who both have core voter groups that are those loud veterans. And I was collateral damage. But what that meant is it destroyed my business, my livelihood. I moved states. I isolated myself, as you do when you are getting trolled. It was really hard. I attempted suicide. I ended up in hospital for 2 months. I turned it all in on myself, I guess. Like I felt like, now I look back and I think, wow, I felt like I'd been gaslit by the nation. I just couldn't, it didn't make any sense to me. I couldn't understand it. And I think I just, in my head, I couldn't process it. It made no sense. And I spiraled, and it took me a long time to come out the other side of that. And and my family and I, we completely changed our lives and the way we live and what we do. And so it's had the most profound impact on my life and my family's life. Yeah.
That's really hard to hear, Samantha, and I'm really sorry about that. And you did put everything on the line. It's cost you so much. And, when we think about whistleblowers in Australia, they have historically confronted obstacle after obstacle, punishment for attempting to tell the truth. But you weren't even a whistleblower. You were commissioned by the Chief of the Defence Force to inquire into war crimes. What kind of message do you think that sends to others hoping to hold powerful institutions to account?
Well, it's not encouraging, because it says there is a lot to risk and there is a lot at stake, and you won't necessarily be supported. At the end of the day, I'm this small business owner, being crushed by an arm of the government. It was just the power differential was massive. I didn't have the resources to fight legally. I had nothing. I had nothing left. Yeah, and so the message it sends, and we look at these, David McBride.
Here is a man who was a major in the Australian Army. And he became aware of serious systemic issues with our Defence Forces. It went up the chain of command, including to the delegate of the Chief of the Defence Force. He then went to the Australian Federal Police and made a formal complaint. That was ignored. He eventually got a response by the Australian Federal Police 3.5 years later when they raided his home and they charged him for leaking information to the media. David McBride faces life imprisonment because that's what the penalty is.
Richard Boyle.
In April last year, Richard Boyle's Adelaide home was raided by the Australian Federal Police. It was days after the former tax office employee spoke to ABC's Four Corners program about debt collecting tactics used inside one of Australia's most powerful institutions. Since blowing the whistle, he's now facing a staggering 161 years in prison. Almost as much.
Like, there is no encouragement to speak out. Yeah. So I don't really understand what whistleblower protections are there for.
Mm. Well, we have seen former SAS soldier Ben Roberts-Smith recently lose an historic multi-million-dollar defamation trial and was forced to pay the legal costs of media outlets he took to court, including our papers. Does that outcome give you any hope for justice? Or perhaps do you think at the very least there will be more attention and momentum towards the Brereton report and the implementation of its findings?
I think, yes. I mean, I think people are now going back to those reports and perhaps reading them with a different, through a different lens. I think at first everything was read with a, not sure. Now I think the more we've seen the footage that's come out, all of the Ben Roberts-Smith evidence, witnesses, now people are thinking, actually, maybe there was something to all of that.
And finally, Samantha, I'm just curious, looking back now to the time when you put together that report and sent it through to the Army Chief, would you do the same again now? Your life has been turned upside down as a result. You've lost your business. You've had to move states. You've feared for your life at certain points. Do you have any regrets?
Yes and no. Would I do it again? I would. And I know that because I've spent a long time reflecting on that question. And I would do it again because of the bravery of the people who spoke to me and disclosed what they did. And I do feel a duty of care and an obligation to them. They trusted me with those stories. And so I would absolutely do the same thing again. There's perhaps things along the way I might have done differently since then. I've learnt a lot. But to be perfectly honest, where I live now and what my life is like, I wouldn't necessarily change it. I'm happy. I'm in a wonderful community, and I'm now at a stage where I feel my brain is back online, and I want to write about this stuff. I want to write what I've learnt and what I think all of this means for Australia, and for the wars that we readily go and fight in more broadly.
Well, thank you so much for your time and bravery, Samantha.
Thank you.
If this episode has brought up anything for you, 24/7 crisis support is available at Lifeline. Call 13 11 14. Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Margaret Gordon. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Julia Carr-Katzel. This is Please Explain. Thanks for listening.